So we are really excited today to have Marie Mangold present her research. Marie is a PhD candidate in Hispanic Linguistics here at the University of Minnesota. She has been a graduate research assistant at CARLA for a couple of our current projects, and she is currently a CARLA Fellow. And the topic of her presentation today is Understanding Advancedness in L2 Spanish Writing, Pedagogical Implications of Using Measures of Complexity and Accuracy. So Marie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kate. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming to my presentation. As Kate mentioned, my name is Marie Mangold, and I am a PhD student in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies here at the university, where I study Hispanic Linguistics and Second Language Acquisition. My presentation today is titled Understanding Advancedness in Second Language, or L2 Spanish, and the Pedagogical Implications of Using Measures of Complexity and Accuracy. So the basis of this project, the reason in which I was interested in pursuing this was conceptualizing what it means to be advanced in second language, specifically in second language writing in the context of Spanish. And so upon thinking about what does it mean to be advanced, the conceptualizations we might be familiar with are curricular sequencing. And what I mean by that is, for example, here at the University of Minnesota, when our students get through the 1000 level courses, generally a 4-semester sequence, that might be an example of perceiving a second language learner as advanced once they complete those courses. Another example is looking at genre and register that an L2 speaker is producing in their discourse, specifically certain types of genre features with respect to linguistic features in writing. And perhaps more common is the idea of a proficiency scale. And you are likely familiar with the proficiency scale from the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, or perhaps the Interagency Language Roundtable from the federal government. So each of these organizations have a proficiency scale with which you might or may not be familiar. And the reason why this matters, this idea of, well, what does it mean to be advanced, is this is the level in which working fluency is achieved according to the Global Seal of Biliteracy. And working fluency are situations in which a language learner, those situations might be familiar, routine, or unfamiliar, and they're able to navigate those situations either in formal or informal discourse. And so that's what working fluency is described as. And so with the concept of proficiency scales like that of ACTFL conceptualize proficiency versus utilizing empirical linguistic reality of L2 discourse. And so that might look like quantitative or objective measures. And one means of addressing that are through what are called CAF measures. That's what I refer to them as here, or complexity, accuracy, and fluency measures. And I will get into some examples of those, as that's what I use in the analysis of this project. And so upon using perhaps different measures of complexity, if they are found to be distinct to certain proficiency levels, they're established as what are called linguistic correlates. And so these are 3 notable studies that have established linguistic correlates according to measures of fluency in the ACTFL scale by Brown, Cox, and Thompson, also measures of complexity in the ACTFL scale by Rubio and Taylor, and then measures of accuracy by Longor and Jackson. And so in each of these studies, measures of fluency or accuracy or complexity were used to distinguish learners and their discourse at different proficiency levels. However, all 3 of these projects look at oral proficiency. Of course, there's other research, other literature out there that explore CAF measures with respect to proficiency levels, but these are notable to the methodology and the establishment of linguistic correlates. And so this project instead looks at writing proficiency. So the concept of complexity, holistically speaking, I'm utilizing the definition from Ellison Bark-Wisen, in which it is the extent to which learners produce elaborated language, often entailing subordination and elaboration, and the level of sophistication. And so if we think of complexity as this umbrella, within complexity, we have lexical complexity. So referring to lexicon or vocabulary, if you're not familiar with that term, and also syntactic complexity, which I'll get into in the next slide. But complexity as a whole is this umbrella in which different types of complexity fall. And so lexical complexity in second language or L2 writing is often looked at with respect to development. So how a second language writer's writing develops over the course of a certain period of time, whether it's 6 weeks, a semester, a academic year. So that is common in literature, and less common is looking at lexical complexity according to the proficiency level of the L2 learner. The two measures of lexical complexity employed in this project are lexical density and lexical diversity. And so lexical density is the percentage of lexical or content words in a text. And that means the words that contribute semantically to a text. So that might be your nouns, your adjectives, verbs, some adverbs, depending on the definition of the researcher. And lexical density is a measure that has been shown to evolve over time. It is also affected by task type and text genre, so how the language learner is producing the discourse in what context. It's also been shown to both decrease as proficiency level increases, as well as increase. So an array of findings with respect to lexical density and proficiency level. As for lexical diversity, this is the variety of word types in a text. So the number of different word types, and I'll give you examples when I talk about the analysis, but lexical diversity has been shown to be an indicator of second language writing quality. It's been linked to vocabulary breadth and knowledge of lexical features. It's been shown to increase as proficiency level increases, as well as it's been found to be positively correlated with ratings and proficiency of L2 writing. So more consistent across the board with lexical diversity and more of a mix here with lexical density. As for syntactic complexity in second language writing, I employ Ortega's definition in that the range of forms that surface in language production and the degree of sophistication, as well as the variety, diversity, or elaborateness of grammatical resources are what comprise syntactic complexity. And measures of syntactic complexity may include length, coordination, variety, sophistication, acquisition of timing, among others. And in this project, there are 3 different measures of syntactic complexity employed: the mean length of T-unit, clauses per T-unit, and average length of error-free T-unit. And so we see each of these is rooted in a T-unit. Again, I'll give you an example of what that is when I get to the analysis. But with studies that are existing, we see that there are significant differences with these measures of syntactic complexity according to proficiency level. However, the study from Rubio and Taylor deals with oral proficiency. And then with clauses per T-unit, it's been found also as insignificant, specifically in the context of L2 Spanish writing. Lastly, for average length of error-free T-unit, this has been shown to be a reliable predictor of proficiency level in second language learners of English. And so again, there are other studies, additional literature, but here are a few just to support what exists with respect to these measures and proficiency level of the second language learner. As for accuracy, in this project, accuracy is defined as discourse that is free from errors. And so measures of accuracy may include the frequency or severity of errors, error type, or ratio of error-free T-unit. In general, with respect to second language Spanish writing, it's underexplored when considering proficiency level as a factor. The study from Longor and Jackson is a good encompassing study in that it looks at different types of errors according to proficiency level. And in this context, or in this case, accuracy with respect to these types of features was found to be significant in second language learners of Russian, and again, in oral proficiency. So different context, but just a demonstration of how measures of accuracy may be established as linguistic correlates according to proficiency level. The 2 measures employed for accuracy in this study are ratio of error-free T-unit and errors per 100 words. And so ratio of error-free T-unit has been found to be significant in second language production according to different tasks. So that is how the second language learner is assessed, whether it's writing, speaking tasks, but also looking at the development of their language throughout a certain period of time. Ratio of error-free T-unit has also been a reliable predictor of proficiency level, but again, in second language learners of English. As for errors per 100 words, The two studies I have here also look at oral proficiency, and they have a slightly different definition or a slightly different take on errors per 100 words. But the point here is that there is a significant correlation for a certain error type here, morphological errors. But in respect to perceived fluency and comprehensibility, those are two global measures, as well as with Polat and Kim, looking at longitudinal development. So those are very different contexts in the present study, but on previous literature regarding this measure here. So the purpose of looking at complexity and accuracy together is that it's important to explore multiple CAF measures at the same time, because if we are only focusing on accuracy, that alone is not a sufficient representation of second language abilities. So if you're a language teacher, think about being in the classroom with your students and they write a paper. The accuracy of that writing is not the only demonstration of their ability to communicate. If they're writing a persuasive essay, their ability to use certain language features or cohesiveness in the essay might also be representations of their second language abilities. So accuracy alone, pairing that with complexity broadens the analysis, of course, but also it's not always possible to separate accuracy from analyses that measure length and content. And that is because there are trade-offs that exist between accuracy and complexity, preventing that collinear relationship. And so in other words, it's possible that second language learners are really paying attention to accuracy in their discourse, and complexity takes a backseat while learners focus their effort and cognitive load there. So the goal of this study was to determine how complexity and accuracy compare between ACTFL's intermediate high and advanced low proficiency levels in written narratives by second language learners of Spanish. And again, that advanced low level was chosen because of that emphasis on advancedness and what does that mean? And then the next level right below that, so intermediate high, is that comparison group. And so the research questions of this project are: how do lexical complexity, syntactic complexity, and accuracy vary in written text according to the proficiency level of the L2 learner of Spanish in the writing? The participants of this project are 40 adult second language learners of Spanish who are enrolled at a major university in the Western United States. And so 20 of those participants received a score of intermediate high and the other 20 advanced low. And these scores were assigned by raters who are trained by ACTFL. With the 40 participants, this is from that was a random stratified sample from a larger project that aims at it's used as a diagnostic tool to place students into a corresponding course at the university. So we see here the gender is balanced between the proficiency groups as well as the number of participants in the proficiency groups. And we have very similar ages between the two proficiency groups as well. So the task employed is what is called the Language Ability Self-Evaluation Resource, henceforth referred to as the LASER. And this task estimates speaking and writing proficiency as described in the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. And so part of this resource involves speaking and writing prompts that are targeted at test takers' self-assessed proficiency level. And so the LASER is comprised of two parts. Part one asks questions about the language learner's background, motivation, willingness to communicate, as well as the questions that are generated in part two are based off what the language learner shares in part one. The questions generated in part two are modeled after the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, and this project only looks at their written essays in response to the LASER and their respective writing proficiency test scores. And so the essays that were produced in part two were rated by certified ACTFL raters. And this project looks at the intermediate and advanced level prompts. There was no consideration of novice level prompts or superior, for example. The LASER is distributed via Qualtrics. The instructions are in English, and there's no time restriction for the LASER. So looking at the analysis and the different CAF measures used in this project, for the lexical complexity measures, lexical density is the number of lexical or content words divided by the total number of words in a text. And content words are those that contribute semantically, as I mentioned. And so that may include nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, or some adverbs, depending on the definition used by the researcher. Function words, on the other hand, are those that contribute grammatically to a text. So that might be prepositions, articles, conjunctions, etc. So each text and the words used in the text were coded to be content or function words, and this was completed manually. As for lexical diversity, this is the percentage of different word types in a text. And what I mean by word type is if we think about one verb and the different conjugations it has, that is one word type, as we see down here, the different conjugations of the verb hablar, to talk, and all of the conjugations that are part of that constitutes as one word type. And so the corpus analysis software called ANCA was utilized to generate a word list for each text and the frequency of the words utilized in that text. And then with that word list, the different word types were grouped together in order to calculate the type token ratio. So that is what is used to find lexical diversity. And then it's divided by the total number of words in the text. As for syntactic complexity, a T-unit is the basis of each of these three syntactic measures here. And so a T-unit is composed of a main clause and its subordinate clauses that are connected or embedded within the main clause. An example of that would be if I were to say, if you have a productive week, you will have a restful weekend. Well, first of all, if you're a teacher, you know that's not always the case. But with that sentence, if I were to say, if you have a productive week, that cannot stand alone. So if you will have a restful weekend but because that clause is attached to you will have a restful weekend, it's part of one unit, that T unit, because if you have a productive week cannot stand alone. So that's an example of a T unit. And so the T units were identified for each writing sample from the participants in order to find these measures. So the mean length of T unit is the average number of words per T unit, clauses, average number of clauses per T unit. And then length of error-free T unit involved identifying the morphological, syntactic, and lexical errors within each text. This did not include orthographic or punctuation errors. And the primary reason for that is that, at least in my experience, language learners, when they use technology to produce discourse, they don't always, one, know how to use accent marks, or two, might choose not to. And so determining that and whether that was a factor was not a possibility in this analysis. And so those types of errors were not taken into consideration. As a second language speaker myself, I looked at the text and identified the morphological, syntactic, and lexical errors, but then I also shared the raw text that had not been analyzed yet with a native speaker of Spanish who's from Colombia, and then we compared our error analyses and established inter-rater reliability. As for accuracy, the two measures, we have a ratio of error-free T unit, and this involves identifying the error-free T units in each text, dividing that by the total number of T units, and this is recorded as a percentage. Then errors per the first 100 words was determined by identifying the errors per the first 100 words from each sample, and then recording that number of errors. And so this measure is influenced by Pola and Kim and Suzuki and Kormos. Again, these are very different contexts. Both of these studies look at oral proficiency in L2 English. So this is an adaptation of the measures employed by these two studies. With the statistical analysis, SPSS was used to determine whether the data met the common assumption of normality using a Shapiro-Wilk test. Not all the CAF measures met that common assumption of normality, and therefore a Kruskal-Wallis test was used with a lowered p-value of 0.007. So upon running the statistical tests, here we have the results. This is specific to lexical complexity, and what the descriptive statistics show are the numbers here without running the statistical test is that it seems that the intermediate high group outperforms the advanced low group, although very, very slightly. So we see with lexical density, the numbers are very comparable, but the intermediate high group is slightly higher. And we see a similar finding here with lexical diversity. So it suggests that participants at the intermediate high level are using a greater ratio of content words and a greater variety of word types. But this difference is very small. And as we see upon running a statistical test, that difference is not significant at the intermediate high and advanced low level. As for syntactic complexity, we see analogous values again here. So if we're looking at the intermediate high results compared to the advanced low, the numbers are really similar again, all within the same number basically. So unlike lexical density, it seems that the advanced low group is slightly outperforming the intermediate high group, having longer T units on average, a greater number of clauses per T unit on average, and longer error-free to units on average as well. However, again, we see that upon running a statistical test that these results are not significant. So these three measures of syntactic complexity are not significant according to the proficiency level of the L2 writer in this project. As for accuracy, we see stark differences in the results. So here we have the intermediate high group, and we see that they're committing over 9 errors on average per first 100 words, whereas the advanced low group is committing under 6 errors on average per the first 100 words. And then for ratio of error-free to unit, we see a stark difference between these numbers as well, suggesting that the advanced low group writes greater rates of T units that are error-free on average compared to the intermediate high. And when running the statistical tests, we do see that errors per the first 100 words is found to be significant according to the proficiency level of the language learner here. The ratio of error-free to unit comes close, but it is not established as significant according to the statistic test here. So taking in consideration those results, the statistical test run, what does this tell us about advancedness and linguistic correlates in the context of L2 Spanish writing? With respect to lexical complexity, first I'll talk about lexical density, and the next slide discuss lexical diversity. But overall, for lexical complexity, it appears that the intermediate high learners have slightly higher rates of lexical density and diversity, but the statistical test revealed no significant difference according to proficiency levels, meaning that these two measures of lexical complexity cannot be utilized to differentiate L2 writing of Spanish at these two levels. And one general reason for that might be that lexical complexity may increase to a certain degree before plateauing. And I'll explain that in greater detail when I discuss syntactic complexity as well. Specific to lexical density, this both supports and contrasts with existing findings. And the reason for that might be text length. This is very common in analyzing lexical density across studies, across languages, different contexts. And so what happens with lexical density and text length is as the text increases in length, inevitably more function words are used, more prepositions, more conjunctions, more articles, etc. And so that's going to change the density of the text. If we think about if a learner submits an assignment that's 2 sentences long, the lexical density of that assignment is going to be really, really high, versus if a different learner produces a whole paragraph of 8 to 10 sentences, inevitably there are more function words in that paragraph, and so the lexical density will decrease there. Additionally, the definition of content words might be an explanation for differences in findings across the board and how a researcher is coding content versus function words. And then for lexical diversity, similarly, it both contradicts and supports previous findings. And the explanations for lexical diversity, that was the variety of word types in a text. It might be different contexts in which lexical diversity is measured. And so that might be the different proficiency levels that are explored. So in Schnur and Rubio, intermediate, mid to advanced proficiency levels explored. So we see a greater range of levels that are included in that analysis. It may be different types of tasks that are utilized to analyze L2 learner discourse, as well as language. It can also be due to the different ranges of proficiency levels. Like I mentioned, here in this study, the proficiency levels are adjacent. So what happens with that is, and what we see in the actual proficiency guidelines, is that often a language learner will demonstrate characteristics of the subsequent proficiency level, but they're unable to sustain discourse at that level. So someone at the intermediate high level might show characteristics of the advanced low level, but they cannot maintain their performance there. Additionally, the categorization of word types for lexical density or diversity, might be an explanation for variation in results, similar to lexical density and how a researcher codes the content and function words. Here, how the researcher defines a word type, whether they include concordance or not. So gender number agreement as one word type, just for an example. With syntactic complexity, none of the measures of syntactic complexity were found to be significant according to proficiency level, meaning that these 3 measures cannot be utilized to distinguish L2 Spanish writing at the intermediate high and advanced low level. And one study that looks at more of an array and holistically syntactic complexity is that of Barreau and Agdapa, who determined that syntactic complexity measures are reliable indicators of proficiency level, which we did not see with this project. Specifically with respect to clauses per T unit, this does mirror Kuyken and Vedder's finding that clauses per T unit is insignificant according to proficiency level in the writing produced by second language learners of Spanish. And this may be that clauses per T unit is significant until a learner approaches a certain higher level in which it stabilizes. And so it's possible, therefore, that a threshold exists for clauses per T unit at the intermediate high level, but then it does not increase at the advanced low level. With length of error-free T unit, this contradicts former previous findings, and that length of error-free T unit is a reliable predictor of proficiency level. This was for L2 learners of English, and the explanations for these results that either support or contrast with existing findings likely are due to contiguous levels. Again, looking at that intermediate high, advanced low level is a limited range. And also we would expect to see overlap in the performance at these levels. Additionally, a study from Restrepo Ramos and Schneider and Rubio, both of those studies observed greater differences in lower levels of proficiency. And the reason for that might be if you consider teaching a introductory language level course. Learners are entering the course with no pre-existing knowledge about the language. From the beginning of the course to the end of the course, we would expect to see significant growth in the students, right? And so as they continue with their language studies, it gets more and more difficult to advance to the higher proficiency level. And so if we consider then, for example, the advanced level and the superior level, it's more challenging to reach that next level as compared to the more novice levels that we see, at least in this study by Restrepo Ramos. Additionally, syntactic complexity and L2 writing can vary according to the context of learning, as stated by Ortega. As for accuracy, what we saw is that the errors per the first 100 words is statistically different between the intermediate high and advanced low levels, at least in the case of second language Spanish writing, whereas ratio of error-free T unit was not significant according to the proficiency level of the writer. And so ratio of error-free T unit contrasted with former findings from Larson, Freeman, and Strom, and who found ratio of error-free T unit to increase as the proficiency level increased as well. And the explanation for that is maybe due to the definition of error-free. And so what's really important to note here is that Larson, Freeman, and Strom included orthographic and punctuation errors in their analysis, whereas this study did not take those types of errors into account. And so if this project did include orthographic and punctuation errors, we would see a much higher rate of committing errors in the text, as well as additional types of errors. And so that is a stark reason across studies for why there might be discrepancies in error analyses. As for errors per 100 words, this contrasts with previous findings, but again, these studies aren't a comparable context. They're more so there to support why this measure or how it was adapted, but just wanted to include. Overall, when we think about these findings and the fact that 6 of these measures were found to be insignificant and 1 measure of accuracy was found to be significant to proficiency level, what does it tell us about defining advancedness or objectively determining whether L2 writing is advanced according to the proficiency level of the writer? We saw that measures of complexity, both lexical and syntactic, were ineffective in distinguishing second language Spanish writing, at least at the intermediate high and advanced low levels. And so the lexical density, diversity, mean length of T unit, clauses per T unit, and length of error-free T unit cannot serve as linguistic correlates, meaning we cannot employ or utilize those measures to distinguish the writing in the context of Spanish between those 2 levels. However, errors per the first 100 words was found to be a significant measure according to proficiency level. So this may serve as a linguistic correlate. And in other words, that means that it provides empirical evidence that it can function as a valid method of quantitatively and objectively distinguishing second language Spanish writing, at least at the advanced level, meaning advanced, low, and intermediate high. However, it's really important to keep in mind that one accuracy measure alone is insufficient. Additionally, the lack of significant differences in complexity and accuracy measures between intermediate high and advanced low levels may be due to that faster rate of growth that's observed at lower proficiency levels, as seen by the study by Restrepo Ramos. This also indicates that second language learners may demonstrate characteristics of both their assigned and subsequent proficiency level. As I was explaining with the proficiency scales and the proficiency guidelines, seeing an overlap in the descriptors, but not sustaining performance at that higher level. Additionally, the trade-offs that occur between accuracy and complexity are possible here. With the one measure of accuracy that was found to be significant, it's possible that learners are focusing more on committing errors than they are determining whether or not their writing is complex, is it elaborate. And so with that, the pedagogical implications of accuracy are limited given it was only one measure that was found to be significant. But if we are aiming for second language learners and their writing to be considered as advanced, we would expect a greater focus on accuracy than complexity, at least at the intermediate high level, to bump students up to that advanced low level. And so the results suggest focusing on error frequency according to that measure of errors per the first 100 words. And recommendations from previous literature for addressing accuracy in second language writing are carefully evaluating rubrics used to analyze L2 writing. So how are we assessing students? How do they know that they're being assessed, or what do they know? What do they understand as how the instructor is going to assess them? And two important pieces that I'd like to include with that is that, first of all, errors might be more salient to language instructors than complexity, or language evaluators, I should also say. At least in my case, when I'm writing feedback on a photo, a discussion, or a paper, I tend to give feedback around errors and what type of errors I see recurring in the learner's writing, and hope that they address that, versus complexity when I'm writing that feedback. Additionally, viewing changes in linguistic features as progress versus interpreting them negatively. What that means is, if we're looking at a text and we see that a learner is consistently producing morphological errors in their text, but later in the semester or in the subsequent course, they aren't producing lexical errors as much, but they're still producing they begin producing a consistent amount of syntactic errors. Although that error commitment is consistent, but the error type changes, that doesn't infer I can't think of the right word, but it doesn't infer anything negative. There might be growth there based on the error type changing. And so with this finding and the fact that one measure of accuracy was found to be significant, it feels somewhat deficit-based to me. And if we're trying to incorporate more of asset-based mindsets, I think perceiving accuracy or beyond accuracy as the representation of language abilities was really important to keep in mind. And briefly, just to jump back here, Hartshorn and colleagues had encouraged intensive error feedback and revision, although I would argue the practicality of that for language instructors. But again, accuracy is not comprehensive in looking at the language learner's abilities. And so this might depend on the framework that's implemented. For example, if a genre-based pedagogy is utilized in the curriculum, looking at how language learners are producing their texts according to different genres, different audiences, or in a multiliteracies approach, looking at how are learners creating meaning, what types of modes are they using, or what available designs are they using to communicate to make a message for a designated audience. And so thinking more broadly beyond just accuracy to how we conceptualize proficiency, I think is really essential to keep in mind here as well. I know the results did not show significant findings with complexity, but to address pedagogical implications based on other literature, just to touch on these briefly, with respect to lexical complexity, what Schnur and Rubio recommend is writing for different genres to develop that lexical complexity in second language writing. What Colombi found was that academic texts have greater lexical density. So if we're looking to see development in L2 writing and the lexical density of that L2 writing, utilizing academic texts as a means of assessing learners might be a method, as well as how are they using embedded clauses as a means to see development and lexical density. And this is supported by you as well in using different genres. and formality. Who is the audience? Are we using formal or informal registers? And similarly with syntactic complexity, to see this develop in the L2 writing context as well. Writing for more public discourse versus personal text. For example, thinking if students are writing a narrative versus writing a persuasive essay, or maybe a different type of text as well, is a means of developing mean length of T unit. And this might involve discipline-specific topics and specific audiences. So keeping in mind the recipient or the interlocutor of these types of texts. Additionally, developing length of production is a means of developing syntactic complexity as found by Burrow and ACTFL as well. Lastly, this is just one tangible specific example that ties together lexical and syntactic complexity, or at least lexical and syntactic mechanisms, by Regina Pankova. So grammatical metaphor has been established as a linguistic feature at the advanced level in second language writing. And so this would be when we have an adjective or a verb, but then we change it to a noun in order to be able to talk about it. So for example, if I think of the verb immigrate, but I want to be able to talk about it as a thing, we would say immigration. And so that's an example, very much scratching the surface, hardly, of grammatical metaphor. And so to conclude this presentation, the limitations in this project are multiple. First of all, the trade-offs that occur between complexity and accuracy. We can state that as a possibility for why one accuracy measure was found to be significant, but we don't really know if that's truly happening here with measures of complexity and accuracy. It's possible, but it's only a possibility. Additionally, the overlap in performance at adjacent levels is very much likely, especially with only looking at a range of 2 proficiency levels here, that intermediate high and advanced low. Lastly, the task is not controlled for time, so that would make it difficult to employ measures of fluency here. So additional steps in projects like these that look at CAF measures, at least based on the findings here, exploring additional measures of accuracy. So this might entail error-free clauses, type of error, frequency, etc., as well as looking at fine-grained measures. Because previous studies have shown genre, formality, and register to be significant with different CAF measures, this would also be worth exploring in the task and what type of language is being elicited from the L2 learners. So using different types of genres, formality, and audiences to see how this affects these measures as well. And to bring this project full circle, so the goal of this project was to determine whether these measures of complexity and accuracy can distinguish second language writing in Spanish at the intermediate, high, and advanced low levels. And we saw that only one measure of accuracy might be able to be established as a linguistic correlate here, but it's only one. It's not sufficient to tease apart those levels. And so exploring additional avenues for empirically, objectively differentiating learners of unique proficiency levels. And so to conclude, I would like to say thank you to CARLA, as well as the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies for co-sponsoring the event, as well as the Center for Language Studies at Brigham Young University for the use of the laser.
Thank you, Marie. Great talk. It's nice to see your research moving forward and hearing a little bit more about your empirical stuff. I found the results really interesting. I was reading the actual proficiency guidelines while you were presenting. And I was paying attention, I promise I was paying attention, but I was just curious to see how those proficiency levels were operationalized by ACTFL. And there's an interesting question in the chat that's kind of related to what I was thinking about, and it's from Carrie. And she said, how do these measures compare to the scoring guidelines given to trained ACTFL raters? So, just thinking about how these proficiency guidelines are operationalized and then rated. Is there a connection between what ACTFL is doing and what you're doing in your research?
I mean, it's possible. I'm not familiar with the training that raters at ACTFL do or complete, neither for the OPI, the oral proficiency interview, or the writing proficiency test. So I'm unsure of what that training looks like and how that's completed, so that the ACTFL raters know how to determine the level of the L2 learner, unfortunately.
Okay, there's another question in the chat from Vivian, and she was wondering if you included analysis of the complexity of noun phrases for syntactic complexity, because there is some research showing that students at more advanced levels have higher complexity in relation to nominalization or the complexity of the nominal phrase compared to intermediate learners.
I did not include that, but I know that Vivian is very familiar with that measure. And so that would be a good example, if I go back here, of a fine grained measure to employ in the analysis. So no, I'm not familiar and I did not utilize that or employ that measure here, but it would be worth exploring to have more fine grained measures in the analysis and have a more robust analysis in general.
So I'm still waiting for more questions to come in, but I want to go back to what I was thinking about the descriptors that ACTFL provides. And I think for ACTFL, one of the things that's really important is functions, like what language functions can learners carry out, or what tense and aspectual forms are they able to master? So I'm wondering if you've thought at all about the relationship between these more sort of linguistic tests that you're doing and the kinds of information in the ACTFL descriptors that are related to functions and the expression of meaning in the target language as students move through different levels of proficiency.
So the question, could you repeat the question?
Just the connection between the descriptors, which tend not to be very focused on linguistic accuracy, complexity, and fluency, right? You said accuracy and complexity. So the descriptors don't really focus on those very much. They focus more on the language functions that learners can carry out and the types of verb forms, for instance, they can use. Can they speak in the past, the present, future, and so on and so forth. So do you see any relationship between sort of a functional way of describing proficiency and a linguistic way of describing or measuring proficiency?
Yeah, so actually there's a separate project that I'm working on in which I do just that, looking at the different types of verb forms or tenses and aspects utilized in the second language writing. And so what I am doing with that project is using the grading criteria for a specific assessment and taking the language from the assessment and aligning it with a specific CAF measure as a means of informing, well, why am I using the measures that I'm using here? And so in that example, yes, one of the grading criteria for that assessment is looking at the different types of tenses that students are using. And so I don't know if it translates to a specific CAF measure, but I'm using CAF analysis for that project. And I am looking at the different types of tenses that students are using in their written discourse. And so there's no analysis completed for that project right now, but that is something that is related to your question.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting. So there's a question from Darren in the chat, and he asks if your research has led you to change anything in your teaching and assessment in the Spanish classes that you're teaching. In other words, has it raised your own awareness as a teacher in terms of giving students feedback?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's a great question. Yes. So for example, right now I teach an intermediate level course, and to shift the feedback away from focusing on solely errors, I've started giving feedback to hopefully or encourage them to think about how they can write more in a more complex way. And so an example of that is, at least at the intermediate level, we see students write "es interesante," it's interesting. Okay, but why is it interesting? And also, how can you vary your word type there to use a different word aside from interesting? So there I would be addressing lexical complexity a little bit with lexical diversity to help them think of other phrases beyond just "es interesante," as well as explaining and having more elaborate phrases as to, well, why? And so kind of reframing the feedback I'm giving language learners to encourage more complex sentences, both lexically complex and syntactically, and not always focusing on giving feedback that's grounded in errors.
Okay, so we've got another question that just came in. Oh, where did it go? There we go. So there's a question about the methodology of data collection. This is from Daniel, who says, would it be correct to assume that this learner writing was done without access to any outside resources, either printed or digital?
Good question. No, that is not known. It is not a proctored assessment, given it is completed via Qualtrics. So given it's a diagnostic tool, students complete it on their own time. But no, that is not known. Looking at the text analysis, or looking at the analysis and completing that, there was nothing that flagged me as, or that was a red flag to me as inauthentic, or like, for example, the use of translators, given the quantity and types of errors in their writing, but that's not something I can state with certainty. Great question.
Okay, and then we also have a question from Amanda, and she said, I think it was about 6 of your lexical and syntactic variables that came out as insignificant predictors of advancedness. Do you have any insights as to how you might operationalize some of those concepts differently to target other nuances in the constructs, or consider the interaction of multiple constructs in predicting this?
I'm processing the question here. So I think the first thing that comes to my mind is that if a greater range of proficiency levels was addressed, perhaps the results would be different just with that overlap that occurs. I know that doesn't respond exactly to your question, Amanda, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind, in that the fact that 6 of these measures were found to be insignificant. As for how they're operationalized, there are other measures of lexical complexity and syntactic complexity, and especially with the debate over lexical density and text length, when that's not controlled, perhaps employing lexical sophistication or more fine-grained indices in the analysis. I don't know if that answers your question well, but those are the first things that come to my mind.
Well, it sort of gets back to that question I was asking about functions and being able to use different tense and aspectual forms. I mean, Mandy made a comment in the chat after our exchange about that, saying that also gets at variety of forms, which is in the definition of complexity. So that could be another way of, a way of re-operationalizing concepts, or looking at different aspects of complexity to get at a more nuanced understanding of differences across levels. And Amanda says, yes, you did answer her question. So that's it for the questions, Marie. There's some interesting stuff in the chat, so we'll save that and share it with you. But we want to thank you for this really interesting and well-organized and clear presentation. And we want to thank all of you for joining us today. We hope to see you at our last CARLA presentation this semester, and of course, in the fall when we restart our speaker series again. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day. And thanks, Marie.
Thank you for coming.